Your last flight had a name painted on the tail. You booked that name. You paid that name. You trusted that name with your life at 40,000 feet. And there is a very good chance that name does not own the airplane you were sitting in, and there is no way you could have known that from your seat. The airline is a tenant. The plane has a landlord. And the landlord is almost certainly a company you have never heard of, sitting in an office in Dublin that has never sold a single seat to anyone. Here is the number that surprised me. Count every commercial airliner in the world, and more than half of them are leased, rented, rather than owned by the airline flying them. By one major industry count, it is close to 60%, up from a sliver back in the 1970s. So the mental picture you probably have that an airline is a company that owns a fleet of planes is, for most of the planes in the sky, simply wrong. The airline owns the logo, the crews, the schedule, and the risk. Somebody else owns the metal, and you will never see who. It is not on your boarding pass. It is not on the safety card. You could fly 100 times and never once learn who actually owns the aircraft underneath you. If you have boarded more than a couple of flights this year, the odds are better than even that at least one of those planes was a rental and nobody told you which one. Now let me be honest with you right away, because this is where a lot of videos on this topic quietly cheat. If you are watching this in the United States and you are picturing your last domestic flight, there is a real chance I am wrong about your specific plane. North America is the exception. Here, only about 40% of the fleet is leased, and that share has been falling. The big legacy carriers, American, Delta, United, tend to own a lot of their aircraft because they can borrow cheaply enough to buy them. It is in Europe, Latin America, and Asia where you climb up towards 70%. So this is a global truth with a very American asterisk. And I would rather hand you that asterisk now than have you catch me on it later. But the asterisk does not touch the machine, because whether it is a plane over Jakarta or a plane over Dallas, the structure underneath is identical, and that structure is the whole point. Get it, and you will understand why 12 weeks ago an airline you have flown could vanish overnight and its planes could just keep flying for somebody else. Hold on to that. We will get there. First, let me show you how the money actually moves, because it is stranger than it sounds. Start with the thing that makes people do a double take. An airline will walk into Airbus, order a brand new jet, take delivery of it, and then almost immediately sell that jet to a leasing company and rent it right back. Same plane, same paint. It never stops flying their routes. They just stopped owning it somewhere in the paperwork. Why on earth would you buy a $60 million aircraft only to sell it? 3 reasons, and they are all rational. You get your cash back to run the airline. You hand the risk that the plane loses value to somebody else. And this is the part that matters. You often book a profit on the sale itself. There is a budget airline called Frontier that does this at scale. In its most recent full year, Frontier leased 100% of its fleet. It owned 0 planes. And in some years, more of its reported profit has come not from flying passengers, but from selling its own aircraft to lessors and leasing them back. Sit with that. An airline whose profit in some years comes more from selling its planes than from flying you anywhere. Okay, so the lessor now owns the plane and rents it to the airline. What does that rental contract actually say? This is where the entire business lives, and it lives in one clause. The lease is what the industry calls triple net, and it carries a phrase that lawyers actually nod at. The airline's obligation to pay rent is, and I am quoting the kind of language that shows up in these contracts and in court, absolute, unconditional, and non-refundable, and irrespective of any contingency whatsoever. Read that again. Irrespective of any contingency whatsoever. It means the airline pays the rent whether the plane is full or empty, whether it is flying or sitting on the ground, whether there is a pandemic, a fuel spike, a recession, or a war. The industry has a nickname for this kind of clause. They call it hell or high water, and it is not a bluff. When the airline SpiceJet tried to stop paying during the COVID collapse, arguing that a grounded plane in a global emergency surely counted as a change in circumstances, an English court looked at the clause and said, in effect, no pay. The rent is owed. Hell or high water means hell or high water. Now hold those two things next to each other, because this is the real asymmetry, the thing the whole video is about. The airline sells its product, a seat. one flight at a time into whatever the world happens to look like that morning. Fuel could be cheap, or fuel could have just doubled. The plane could be full, or a virus could have emptied every airport on Earth. The airline eats all of it. The lessor sells its product, the use of the plane, on a contract that runs on average about 7 years into the future at a rent that is owed no matter what happens in those 7 years. The two biggest lessors on the planet are sitting on tens of billions of dollars of rent that is already contracted, already locked, already coming, almost regardless of what happens to aviation. One of these businesses is exposed to everything. The other is exposed to almost nothing. And they are attached to the exact same airplane. Now, here is where I have to stop and correct myself, because I was going to sell you a punchier version of this story, and the punchier version is a lie. I was going to tell you that the airline makes about 4%, and the company that owns the plane makes 44%. It is a great line. It is also wrong twice, and I want to walk you through why, because the true version is actually more damning. That 44% is a real number from the biggest lessor in the world, a company called AerCap. But a huge slice of it came from a one-time event, insurance payouts on the planes that got trapped in Russia after the invasion. Strip that out, and by the company's own adjusted math, the margin is closer to 32%. Still enormous next to an airline. But, and this is the bigger problem, comparing those two percentages is a rigged comparison in the first place. An airline's revenue has a colossal fuel bill running straight through it. A lessor's revenue is basically just rent on an asset. Of course the rent looks fatter. That is like comparing a landlord's profit margin to a restaurant's and concluding the landlord is the better cook. So throw the margin comparison out. Here is the honest one. Write it down because it is worse. Ask not what is the margin, but does this business actually earn a decent return on the money put into it? For airlines, the answer is brutal and consistent. As a global industry, according to the airline's own trade body, airlines have failed to earn their cost of capital in essentially every year since 1996. In plain English, over the long run, all the money, all the risk, all the terror of running an airline has produced a return lower than you would need to justify the investment at all. And it just got worse after fuel spiked in 2026. The industry's forecast profit worked out to only a few dollars per passenger. As that same trade body put it, less than the profit Apple makes selling you a single phone case, the lessor. It quietly earns a normal, healthy return on its equity, somewhere around 10 to 15% in most years, right through the cycle. Not a flashy number, a boring one, a reliable one, and that is the actual humiliation. It is not that the lessor makes some obscene margin. It is that the airline does every hard thing, flies the routes, fuels the jets, staffs the cabins, absorbs every shock the world can throw, and does not reliably clear the bar you would set for any investment at all. While the company that does none of that, that just owns the metal and mails the invoice, clears it comfortably. The party taking all the risk earns less than the party taking almost none. So how does the lessor's boring, reliable machine actually work? Because I do not want to oversell it either. It is a spread business like a bank. The lessor borrows money cheaply because these are big investment-grade companies. They can borrow at a lower rate than the airlines can and then leases the plane out at a higher rate. The gap between the two is the profit. Now, you will see people quote that gap at 7 or 8% and call it the return. Do not believe them, including when the lessor says it. That number ignores depreciation, the fact that the plane is slowly wearing out and losing value the whole time. Once you count that, the real return comes back down to that ordinary 10-ish%. And roughly a quarter of the profit does not come from rent at all. It comes from selling the plane used a decade later into a market so short of aircraft that a well-kept jet can sell for more than the books say it is worth. The lessor is part landlord, part very patient used plane dealer. Which brings us to Dublin, because I keep saying these companies sit in Ireland, and that is not an accident or a coincidence. It is the whole moat. Something like 2/3 of the world's leased aircraft are managed out of Ireland. 14 of the top 15 lessors are there. And they are there for reasons that are entirely legal and entirely deliberate. A low corporate tax rate, rules that let them write the plane off for tax very fast, and crucially, No tax withheld on the rent flowing in from airlines all over the world. Plumb through a web of tax treaties Ireland has signed with dozens of countries. But the deepest part of the moat is not tax. It is a treaty most people have never heard of, called the Cape Town Convention. What it does is simple and powerful. It makes repossessing an aircraft across international borders enforceable. If an airline in one country stops paying, the owner in another country can, in principle, get its plane back. That enforceability is the entire reason a lessor can hand a $50 million machine to an airline it will never fully trust and still sleep at night. The law makes the metal safe. Now, at this point, I owe you the other side, because the honest version of the story is not lessors are risk-free parasites. They are not. When the pandemic hit, governments handed airlines something like $240 billion in support to keep them alive. Nobody bailed out a leasing company, and lessors do get hurt. In 2020, the biggest one lost money. One large lessor, Nordic Aviation Capital, filed for bankruptcy. And when Russia seized around 400 Western-owned jets after the invasion, the lessors ate a write-off in the billions. Real money, real loss. But watch what happened next, because it tells you who is actually protected. Those Russian losses. The lessors had insured the planes. AerCap alone has since booked around $3 billion in insurance recoveries, against a write-off of under $3 billion. It may end up recovering more than it lost. That case is still being fought in court, so I will not call it final. But the shape of it is the shape of the whole business. The airline in a crisis gets a government loan it has to pay back. The lessor in a crisis files an insurance claim. And here is the strongest proof of who really holds the power. When a carrier called Go First collapsed in India, the lessors moved to repossess their planes, and India's courts blocked them for the better part of a year, using an insolvency law that froze the aircraft in place. The treaty that was supposed to make repossession automatic suddenly did not. So what happened? India rewrote its own law in the lessor's favor to bring itself back in line. Sit with that for a second. A sovereign country changed its national legislation because a group of aircraft owners needed to be able to pull their planes back. That is the moat. And when an airline simply dies, you see the whole structure in its purest form. Just 12 weeks ago, an American airline you have flown, Spirit, stopped flying after 34 years, taking 17,000 jobs with it. 3/4 of its fleet was leased. The airline is gone. The planes are not. They are being cleaned up, repainted, and handed to the next tenant into the tightest aircraft market in decades. The brand died. The metal simply changed hands. So is this a scam? No. And I want to be careful here because the steelman is strong. Leasing is the reason half the airlines you have flown even exist. A startup carrier cannot write a check for a $60 million jet. Leasing lets it fly at all. It keeps the fleet young, which means newer, quieter, more fuel-efficient planes for you, and it genuinely does move the risk of a plane losing value onto the party best able to carry it. The head of the biggest lessor once dismissed the whole complaint bluntly. He said lease rates are a tiny fraction of an airline's costs, basically meaningless. And for an airline that owns most of its planes, he is right. Rent is close to a rounding error. But for an airline that rents everything, like Frontier, rent is its third biggest cost and a fifth of every dollar it takes in while it loses money. The tenant model is not free. It is a choice, and the price of that choice is that you spend the rest of the plane's life paying somebody else's return. There is one airline that refused the deal, and it is worth ending on. Ryanair, the one everyone loves to hate, owns almost all of its planes outright, no rent line at all. And notice the direction of the arrow here, because this is the part people get backwards. Ryanair does not own its planes because owning makes you rich. It owns its planes because it already got rich enough, a balance sheet strong enough to buy the metal instead of renting it. Leasing is not a trap somebody sets for airlines. It is the price an airline pays for not yet being rich enough to own its own airplanes. You lease because you have to, and the moment you can afford to stop, like Ryanair, you buy. So here is something to try, and then I will let you go. The next time you are on a plane, look at the little registration code near the tail, a few letters and numbers. Type it into a public aircraft registry when you land. Half the time the owner listed will not be the airline at all. It will be a leasing company or a trust or a name in Dublin you have never heard of. do it once and tell me what you find. Because here is what to carry with you the next time you are in a window seat, watching the wing flex on takeoff. You are sitting inside a $60 million machine. The name on the tail sold you the ticket, hired the pilots, and is carrying every ounce of risk in this entire operation. The fuel, the weather, the economy, the empty seat next to you. And of every party attached to this airplane, the one most certain to be paid tonight is the one that isn't here. It never boarded. It never will. It is in an office in Dublin holding a contract that says it gets paid whether this plane flies or not, and it owns the very thing you are flying in.